all the questions we posed to you yesterday, you had some rest, at least. Without further ado, I will give the floor to the head of delegation, Honorable Minister Puričić. You have the floor.
Thank you, Lady Chair, esteemed guests, esteemed members of the committee. Today we shall attempt to answer the questions that you have posed yesterday. We would like to start with the following order. First, from their directorate, Ms. Miljana Begovic, who is coming from the Ministry of Public Administration, and then later we will have the representatives of the delegation in order to refer on everything that they are covering within their own competencies. Thank you. Dear Lady Chair, ambassadors, members of the committee, I shall attempt to answer the questions that were posed yesterday, to which we did not manage to answer. First of all, regarding access to information, use of information communication technologies, since there were several questions which referred to the same topics, I will attempt to answer to all of them. First of all, I would like to say that the state of Montenegro is actually aware of the importance that information communication technologies and information which are provided via portals, web portals of state institutions, how much they are important not only for the general public, but especially to the persons with disabilities, because now the online world and social networks are a relevant source of information for all of us. And in this regard, the Ministry for Information Society in the previous period and now the Ministry of Public Administration, under whose competencies fall the issues regarding information technologies, are working on improving the access to information and the information actually being provided at the web portals of state institutions. So 2 years ago we drafted a document called Guidelines for Drafting of Internet Presentations of State Bodies, State Administration and Local Administration. And within this document there's a whole chapter that is dealing with web accessibility, where we attempted to not only to people working in the public administration and people who are dealing with developing of these internet presentations, but to the general public as well, to make these guidelines more approachable and to adhere to the international standards when it comes to web accessibility. So within this document we have provided clear directions what an accessible website actually is, and then VCAG standards of accessibility were included as well, and we tried to develop all the forms of the content that are important to different forms of disability. So starting from those who have visual impairment, then hearing impairments as well. And within these activities this year we have finalized the guidelines for development of accessible documents, since we are aware that a website is not only what we can see it on the page of that that website. There is a set of documents which can be downloaded, so laws, secondary legislation and forms, etc., etc. So we have completed detailed guidelines dedicated first of all to the employees of the public administration of Montenegro, which assist them when they create a document that is going to be published at the website, that these documents should be made accessible to everyone. And we included their guidelines for creation of the most frequently published documents published in PDF and Word format, but also DAISY format. And when it comes to state institutions, I can say that they are accessible to up to a level, up to an extent. So the web portal of the government of Montenegro, which within its structure it has the 4 sub-portals of the state administration bodies. It has made some accessibility changes when it comes to contrast on the web pages, then changing the size of the letters. Also, almost every article that is published is accompanied by a video material or an audio material. But we are aware that this is not enough, and in this regard, by the end of this year, we have the plan and we have the funds already prepared, and we hope that we'll complete it by the end of this year to improve the web portal of the government, which will at the same time improve the remaining 54 sub-portals of the state administration bodies. And there was one question regarding public procurements. So we, during the preparation of the tender documentation, we have respected and adhered to the Article 50 of the law on public tenders. So within technical specifications, the person that is, or the body that is ordering or announcing the tender has to include the accessibility criteria. So we provided the recommendations how the developers of these websites should make these websites more accessible. But we are also aware that these websites are not accessible unless administrators are educated enough to do and to provide these materials properly, accessibly. So we plan in the upcoming period to have constant and intensive educations how portal administrators and all of the employees who are publishing the information on these on these websites can apply these guidelines adequately. And also there was a lot of talk regarding cooperation with NGOs and associations of persons with disabilities. We did both of these documents in cooperation with the Association of Visually Impaired Persons and Association of Youth with Disability. So hopefully we will have a more intensive cooperation and we will get some assistance from them so that their requests are respected as well. This is what I wanted to say up until now. If you have any additional questions, I'm here for you. Thank you. Good morning, esteemed members of the committee. First of all, I would like to answer to the question regarding participation of representatives of NGO sector, which are representing persons with disabilities in the Commission for allocation of the funds from games of chance. So this commission has 6 sub-commissions. In each of them there are 3 members, and one of them has to be a representative of NGO sector. The same goes for this area, fulfilling the needs of persons with disabilities. So I quote its title now. The mandate of the last commission was 4 years, so for 3rd year they have completed the allocation of these funds, and the colleague from NGO sector has been actively involved in the work of this commission. So a month ago we have completed this competition for the current year, and what is a good thing is that we had a high level of consensus. So us from the government and our colleagues from the non-governmental sector in the part which refers to the assessment of the quality of programs and projects, and the lists created in accordance with this are a witness to the accordance between the members. And also there was a question regarding Common Scheme Most institution. Common Scheme Most is the only institution in Montenegro which provides accommodation to persons who are adults or elderly with intellectual disability. In this institution, currently there is 110 beneficiaries. Out of them, 61 are male and 49 are female. average length of stay in this institution is 18 years. What is important to highlight at the very beginning is that this is an institution where accommodation is provided exclusively based on the decision of the custodian bodies, so it cannot happen, or guardianship bodies, so it cannot happen that a neighbor or a relative brings this person to Komanski Most and puts him or her there. So the competent centers for social work or other competent bodies, in the case of need, place that person, and this is used only as the last option, last resort, unless there are no other viable options, and there is then a plan of services made for that individual, and the individual is involved in the drafting of this plan, and after the decision is made on the placement of that individual, the professionals from Komanski Most, together with the representatives of the Center for Social Work and guardian of that person, and that person, of course, is also involved within his or her capacities. How much, it depends how much they can understand and make the decision. Then they draft the plan of stay of that individual. So they start from presenting in detail the life up until then of that person. We recognize the risks, but also strengths which should be used in order to make his or her accommodation and stay as productive as possible. We are also drafting the normative legal protection for that individual, so if that person has some property, has certain income, or some real estate or whatever, we precisely define who is in charge of taking care of that property or real estate. If the person is able to do it by himself or herself, we also make some plans how to supervise and monitor the spending of the income that that person has. Usually these are people who do not have a huge income or any income at all, but if they have some pocket money or pension and they can spend the money by themselves with some support from side, we try to keep records of all of the spending and income. We also make plans for healthcare, which is also an important segment in these cases. So before a person is placed into Komanski Most, we get all of the required medical documentation in order that the competent and professional workers from Komanski Most know if they need maybe perhaps some therapy or maybe they need some additional medical treatments. They know that how and when to provide it, and if it happens that we had some urgent medical interventions, because in our legislation we also have that form of accommodation provided. Of course, the guardianship body is always involved. So if it happens, for example, that a person who was taking care of an individual dies in the meantime, and we are speaking about severe and moderate intellectual disabilities, because we put only those kind of individuals into Komanski Most. Sometimes there is maybe an urgent case to place them in Komanski Most. Then we immediately and urgently start with the inspection of medical records, checking the health care situation. We do this within the community where those individuals live. But the institution Komanski Most also has a certain number of doctors which provide regular health care. They are associates of Komanski Most, like neuropsychiatrist, dentist, physiatrician, gynecologist, orthopedist, neurologist, and cardiologist. So they don't work at Komanski Most, but they come regularly. Besides healthcare, we also have plans for occupational therapy and working therapy. So what is most important for the beneficiaries is how they are going to spend their days in Komansky Most. So we try to devise a set of activities where they can get involved. We also try to take care, having in mind everything that I've mentioned before during their stay, is that they are accommodated in an environment which is suitable for them, not to put them in a room who, according to certain characteristics, would not conform with their needs or affinities. Also, we are also working on maintaining and increasing the hygienical habits, ability to take care of themselves, and everything that is necessary, like practical knowledge required for their daily living. And Komansky Most institution is also providing regular institutional and out-of-institutional activities, including going to sport events, trips, excursions, visiting cultural events. Also, they like to go shopping, so basically everything that all of the other people do in their communities. And the state is regularly providing organized and paid vacations during summer and winter holidays in the facilities in Lovchen Mountain and Bečići, which is in the municipality of Budva in the coastal region. Also, I spoke yesterday about the security and safety of these beneficiaries is monitored closely, and there were monthly meetings of the representatives of institutions and competent bodies and guardians, not guardians, but actually those who are in charge of these cases, who are working on these cases in the centers for social work, where they could discuss all of the issues from the areas which are relevant to the individual beneficiaries, because it is required that these plans are regularly revised. It was done based on under the supervision of the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare, and the representative of the ministry was present. Now it is no longer necessary to do it in this way, because we have this system called social card, where we electronically connected the institutions and centers for social work, and there is a list for monitoring where we register everything that is happening regarding these beneficiaries, so their caseworkers get information basically on daily basis what is happening with them, and we also organize regular revisions which are planned, so it cannot happen in practice that they are not completed on time. Besides this, besides having these forms of supervision and monitoring, social inspections are regularly visiting the Komansky Most institution. We had several NGO coalitions which also performed monitoring regarding the work of Komansky Most. They provided some useful remarks, and I believe that there is a high percentage of them that were adopted and implemented. CPT Commission, which previously had quite a low assessment of the work of this institution, now they have basically no remarks regarding their work, and Ombudsperson in Montenegro also quite frequently performs monitoring of the work of this institution, which also provides a significant boost, and we can see progress in the work of Komansky Most. So we had some question whether there are some violations of the rights of beneficiaries, whether there are any cases of torture. And we had a case in March where a beneficiary, so his left foot was fractured and there were some bruises under his right eye. And then immediately in the morning, once we noticed this, we talked with the medical technician who was on duty that night and who was supposed to monitor that individual, that beneficiary. That technician was suspended first for 3 months. In the meantime, we have initiated an investigative procedure. It was proved that he was guilty for the unfortunate event, and he was fired, of course. And we have initiated a criminal procedure against this technician. So in our law on social and child protection, it is prohibited to punish in any form the beneficiaries of these institutions. So this is something that we need to pay attention closely, and we are trying to do this. But of course, we are not immune to these kinds of events, as is the case basically in all of the institutions all around the world. These things happen, so it is important that these cases are noted and processed, and of course prevention of these cases is up to the employees of these institutions, and we need also to educate the staff and the beneficiaries. So previously we had quite a lot of these educations for the staff. I forgot to mention that there is 75 employees in Komansky Most institution. Out of them, 12 professionals and other are associates. Educations that we have organized lately. So one of the most important ones referred to the communication strategies in the work with beneficiaries with severe intellectual disabilities, and these educations were organized for all of the employees, so not only for the professionals working there, but also, so not for the expert staff, but also the cooks and guards and all of the other staff. So the expert who stayed in the Komansky Most institution and basically lived with them on a daily basis. So he was therefore made available himself for all of the employees to ask all of the questions that they might have had, and this was one of the most important educations that we have organized in this institution. So I think that's it up until now. So if you have any additional questions, I'm here for you.
Uvaženi članovi komiteta, poštovane kolege, dobro jutro.
Dear members of the committee, dear friends, good morning. First of all, there is a question related to Article 12 of the Convention relating to the manner in which we regulated the equal recognition of persons before the law. This is guaranteed by the Constitution of Montenegro as the highest legal act in our country. The next question was related to, it was actually a comment related to the nature of a job of a social worker and the role of the social welfare centers in the proceedings of taking away legal capacity, or depriving a person of his or her legal capacity. So in this procedure for partial or full deprivation of legal capacity, if the social welfare center is addressed by a person who, according to the law on a non-judicial proceedings, has a right to such a proceeding, the professional worker of a social welfare center will conduct an informative interview with this person. During this interview, the essence of the deprivation of legal capacity is explained in relation to this procedure, and if the professional in the social welfare center in this procedure assesses that in this specific situation it is not necessary to initiate the proceeding for deprivation of legal capacity, then the person is explained other forms of guardianship, such as guardianship for special cases. So this is a procedure before the social welfare center. During this procedure, evidence is gathered which indicates that the person is not able to use specific rights and meet specific obligations. And of course, there are also the supportive documents necessary for the procedure. In the decision of the center, it is explicitly stated what were these cases where guardianship for special cases is approved or appointed. Also, the person is monitored, and in relation to this, we should note that in the cases where legal capacity was deprived in full or partially, there is an obligation of the guardian for special cases to annually report on his or her work, and also if there is a specific situation, then to report even more often than that. Also, the social welfare centers prepare the action plans or plans of activities with activities for a certain period of time. And while making this activity plan, the process of making the plan involves the guardianship authority, the professional, and of course the person himself or herself, if this is possible. I also wish to note that the guardian cannot, or the case manager cannot be the guardian at the same time of a person. Guardians for special cases are selected from among the employees of the social welfare centers, but it cannot be the same person as the case manager. The next question was relating to the data about the number of persons deprived of legal capacity. I can provide a couple of pieces of information related to a certain time period. So, for example, by 31st of December 2016, in the period from this date to the 31st of March 2017, in the territory of Montenegro, in the proceedings before the competent courts, 32 cases were finalized of full deprivation of legal capacity, 3 of partial, 3 requests were withdrawn, and 2 proceedings were still pending for returning legal capacity. As for the question about procedural adaptations, judicial ones, when it comes to persons with impaired hearing, in practice it happens that, for example, if a person cannot be heard in a written way or any other way, an interpreter is summoned as a person that can communicate to the person that is being heard. The next question was related to the payment of these legal aids. It's important to say that this is regulated through the law on free legal aid, and persons with disabilities are in this law recognized inter alia as a category that is entitled to free legal aid. One of the questions was also whether the persons with disabilities could be judges and notaries. The response is yes, because there are no profiles or occupations that would not be possible to be exercised because of a disability. It's just the matter of qualifications. When it comes to the question related to the accessibility of ATMs, what I can say is that we are largely respecting the physical accessibility criteria of the ATMs, but the problem is, of course, the services when it comes to the ATMs. Unfortunately, at this moment, we still do not have developed these services, but what's important to note is that the problem was recognized, and that in the coming period, we are certainly going to attempt to find a solution to this as well, in cooperation with the competent authorities. The next question was related to the participation of children in judicial proceedings in the context of respect for their opinion. So when it comes to this issue, Article 67 of the family law is fully devoted to the right of the child to free expression of opinion. The provisions of this article are general and generally binding, and the right of a child is recognized to freely express his or her opinion on all issues related to the child. So this is the general provision. When it comes to the right of the child to free expression of opinion in a judicial proceeding, it is regulated through Article 317 as well, given the sense and the importance of this right. In order to create the conditions for the children to exercise these rights, several rules have been prescribed. Thus, in paragraph 1 of this article, it says that the court is obliged, which is dealing with family relations, to enable the child to express his or her opinion, and it is emphasized here that this is the right of the child, which is exercised only if the child wishes to use this right or to say something. One of the questions was related to risky situations. Of course, this is the competence of the Ministry of Interior. Now, there are measures and procedures to act in the situations of risks and emergency humanitarian situations at the state and local level. When it comes to the persons with impaired hearing, there was a question or a comment related to the emergency or risky situations. Information is possible through the public media, through the sign language, and through also subtitled translation in the TVs. I think I managed to cover the issues related to my part, my field of work, but I'm anyway at your disposal if there are any further needs to comment or ask something. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would like to reflect on a couple of questions from the sector of the healthcare, which we received yesterday, and which are of exceptional importance for the health system and especially for individuals, because the system as such is viewed globally and an individual is seen as a person, and we are trying to enable everyone to live a dignified life as it should be. One of the questions was related to psychiatric patients or persons with psychiatric disorders. What I can say today is that in Montenegro, at the primary, secondary and tertiary levels, psychiatric system is developed, or the healthcare is developed when it comes to psychiatric illnesses and states. At the primary level, we have the healthcare centers, which there are 18 in Montenegro, with the healthcare stations, a large number of them in certain areas, basically focused in rural areas where health services are also provided, including the psychiatric services, and especially with these are the areas, for example, in Podgorica, which is territorially large and which has a couple of healthcare centers, and also a number of health stations in rural areas where healthcare is provided at the primary level of healthcare. Now, as for the tertiary level, Montenegro has 7 general hospitals in the public sector, and each of the hospitals has a department for psychiatric illnesses, where psychiatric services are provided to the users of these services in the sector of healthcare. And at this tertiary level, there is also the psychiatric clinic working within the clinical center of Montenegro as the only institution in Montenegro at this level, and a renowned healthcare institution, which is also the scientific research basis for the medical faculty in Podgorica. The healthcare services also include the special hospital, special psychiatric hospital in Dobrota in Kotor. Montenegro does have 2 more special hospitals, but these are not psychiatric hospitals. One of them is in Risan for orthopedic cases, and the other one is in Brezovic for lung diseases. So it's not by chance that these are called special hospitals. These are healthcare institutions of secondary level, which are closely specialized or narrowly specialized for a certain area of provision of health services in the field of medicine. I have information here. You asked for percentages, but I can tell you that in healthcare institutions at the primary level, so this is when it comes to hospitals, so in general hospitals there is about 20 beds for psychiatric patients. In the psychiatric clinic of the clinical center of Montenegro, there is 20 beds, so 20 patients can be accommodated. But it is also my obligation to note that this clinic was constructed in a very distant past, and until recently it was in poor condition. It was a couple of months ago adapted temporarily because the objective was, and we are preparing the project documentation for a construction of a new psychiatric hospital in Podgorica, which will of course be working within the clinical center of Montenegro, but will constitute a clinic for psychiatric diseases now or illnesses. So the biggest problem we have in this area is the psychiatric hospital Dobrota in Kotor. This is a narrowly specialized health institution for this sort of patients with severe or less severe psychiatric, psychological, psychosocial, and as I would call it, legally speaking, not medically, psychosocial needs and disorders which maybe are reflected more on this psychological moment of a patient than presenting a social moment itself, but which is probably a result of probably this social moment is a result of the psychological moment anyway. So in this institution at the primary level, in this special hospital, there are about 240 beds. The capacity is 100% used, but patients with less severe disorders have approval at their personal request, of course, so they can spend weekends at home or with their friends or families. But in this weekend period, when a certain number of beds become available, patients are received as they report with these less severe psychological states, and they get treated, for example, during the weekend, because this is an institution that operates 24/7. So it works in shifts. There is, because of the specific nature of the patients treated, there is it simply operates in shifts, in 3 shifts, including the night shift at full capacity, not on duty manner of work. One of the problems appearing here in this institution is reflected in the fact that there is a large number of convicted persons for various criminal offenses which served their sentence in the Office for Enforcement of Criminal Sanctions in Spuž near Podgorica. And because of the criminal offense committed or because of being stationed in this institution, it is normal that there are some psychiatric disorders, and a number of them also use psychoactive substances, drugs, and other such substances through which they believe they will improve their health condition. And the Office for Enforcement of Criminal Sanctions has only like an infirmary which, however, we assessed that the Office for Enforcement of Criminal Sanctions would also require a hospital. The project documentation was completed, I think, this autumn. In a month, we will start the construction of a general hospital within the Office for Enforcement of Criminal Sanctions, which will include a department for psychiatric patients, and where patients with these psychiatric disorders or needs who are serving a sentence for different offenses will be treated. The reason why I'm saying this is because there is often a disturbed situation in the general hospital in Kotor, because so far this has been the only possibility for us. So there is up to 70 patients who are serving sentences with these special psychological needs being accommodated in this special hospital in Dobrota in Kotor, because for the time being we didn't have and we still don't have other places to accommodate them in. There was a question, if I understood it right, how long do the patients stay in the special hospital or in the psychiatric departments, and are any of them permanently accommodated there, and are they accommodated there voluntarily or involuntarily, because we need to agree that there are severe, less severe and very severe states and conditions. Now when it comes to these less severe or minor conditions or disorders, it's normally, the period is normally 3 to 7 to 10 or 15 days, for example, until the final diagnosis is made and until a certain therapy is provided, and then the patient can go home to be treated in home conditions with the therapy and with daily consultations with the health personnel in this institution. What's very important for these patients who are being treated at their homes and using a home therapy, I need to note here that there is also a domiciliary service which is obliged every day to visit every patient that leaves the hospital once a day, and where there is these domiciliary services obligatorily include a psychiatrist as well. This has proven to be a very good measure, not only for the system but also for the patient, the beneficiary of the services, because there is a large number of them, especially coming from the departments of the general hospitals, the psychiatric clinic of the Clinical Center of Montenegro, and also, unfortunately, in the special hospital there is on average about 100 patients who are staying there for a longer period of time. I cannot specify how long, for how long, but When I say for longer, it happens that they stay for years. And they stay there because these are very severe disorders and very often aggression. All the patients with whom for whom severe illnesses were diagnosed and who show aggression or express aggression against their family or against their surroundings, they really are accommodated in the hospital involuntarily for the simple reason that if they jeopardize their own lives, we should not let them jeopardize other lives, lives of their family members or their surroundings. We hope, because this institution is in a decent condition. I would like to thank you, Senka. Sorry for interrupting. We don't have enough time. The microphone is off. Sorry. Just one or two sentences for biomedicine, please, to provide the answer. Yesterday I heard a question also related to the biomedicine, where analyses are given without consent. So, if I understood it right, I claim here today that, with all the responsibility, when it comes to the field of biomedicine, that the blood analysis cannot be done without the consent of the Ministry of Health, without personal request of the patient, who is seeking the analysis, and without the person's hand signature. And each document in the case needs to be a notary or certified document in order for the consent of the Ministry of Health. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to say something regarding what my colleague said regarding. So I would like to mention that in Montenegro we have 7 centers for mental health established, and within these centers for mental health we have psychiatrists and social workers and psychologists. And what is most definitely the plan for the upcoming period, also through the action plan for mental health, and based on the strategy for mental health, is to have social patients who are staying at the psychiatric institution in Dobrota in Kotor to move them elsewhere with the assistance of the centers who are working in the centers for mental health in municipalities of Montenegro, and in cooperation with centers for social work, and developing individual plans for each of these individuals in order to bring them back to their communities, to provide them with adequate care and services which we are developing in Montenegro. When I say services that we are developing in Montenegro, I need to mention also that within the Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare we have a Directorate for Development of Services at the local level, and in all of the 23 municipalities in Montenegro we have established local plans. Actually, we have drafted plans for social inclusion of these persons, where we have recognized priority services which are primarily required in the territory of those municipalities, and we put a special focus on financing and development of these services. What this directorate is doing is that they are mapping all of these services and needs, and based on this we have made the decision that we need to develop so-called geranta programs, so providing nursing and care in the households, and especially in the northern regions, northern municipalities. So we have supported 14 municipalities in the northern region through this geranta program, so providing assistance in their homes to the elderly. We also plan daycares for the elderly to develop them further in order to keep the beneficiaries in their environments, in their communities, in their families, to provide adequate services and not to place them into institutions like homes for the elderly or some other similar institutions. Also, Montenegro does not have a psychiatric institution within its healthcare system. It's a problem for us as a state. So when it comes to psychiatric beneficiaries with psychiatric disorders and taking care of their needs, so this is a problem for us. And within the psychiatric hospital in Dobrota, where there is approximately 100 beneficiaries staying there who, due to social requirements and needs, they are placed currently within that psychiatric hospital. When it comes to the budget and budgeting for persons with disabilities, for 2016, the right to personal disability allowance, we have provided 3.3 million euros. Then for the right to allowance for personal care and assistance, we have provided 12 million euros. Then when it comes to refunding the traveling expenses, 1.2 million. Subsidies for electric energy bills, where beneficiaries are PVDs, 3.3 million were provided for this purpose. Then costs of accommodation of the beneficiaries in the institutions, approximately 4 million euros. And the salaries for the employees working within these institutions are being financed from the state budget. So all these are expenses for the state. So compensation for the guardians or those who are taking care of PVDs, we provide 4.5 million annually for this purpose. Then child allowance, based on the latest amendments, we have increased this allowance for children with disabilities. So we have increased the amount for 20%. So in total, this is 4.8 million for child allowance for children with disabilities, and actually for all of the children, 4.8 million, and a percentage of those are children with disabilities. So I think that I managed to cover all of the questions. And just one more thing that I did not mention. So the question was regarding personal assistance. So the rule book on norms and standards for services in the community. We have recognized the service of personal assistance for the beneficiaries of care, personal care and assistance. So they can be students or persons who are working, who have a steady job. So this is something that has been recognized in the law on social and child protection, but almost definitely my colleague from the employment sector will say a bit more about these funds. Thank you very much. Good day to all of you. I'd like to say something regarding personal assistance when it comes to the scope of work of the employment agency. So based on the assessment of the needs of these persons and beneficiaries of the program, Employment Agency of Montenegro within the its funds is implementing certain works and activities. So besides others, we announce competitions for personal assistance, and with the goal to provide support in performing providing basic services, which is a priority, with a priority on persons who find difficulties to find a job because of their disabilities. So we have had 344 persons for 8 months period who are providing persons with disabilities assistance in performing basic living functions, and employers who hire a person with disabilities by law prescribes the participation in financing of personal expenditures of personal assistance is calculated up to the amount of the minimum wage in Montenegro based on the time spent working. In 2016, for this subsidy, we have spent 87,000 euros, And for the first half of 2017, we have spent 65,000 euros approximately. So that's it, and for all the other questions, I'm here for you. Just one more thing, the question was regarding institutionalization and whether small group homes and daycare centers are in accordance with the convention or in conflict with it. What I would like to say is that within children's home Mladost in Biela municipality, we had 187 children previously, but in 2017 we have approximately only 90 of them. And what is especially important is that children who are staying at this children's home are children who have disabilities and for whom there is no interest from domestic or foreign adopters to get adopted. So these are children who stay in these institutions, and in cooperation with UNICEF and guidelines that they have provided, we are developing these small group homes in order to keep these children in small group homes and to keep them in their environments, in their communities, closer to their families, also because of the cultural habits that they have. And a small group home was also made or established in the northern region of Montenegro. I think that this is a transitional unit, so when they become of age, they will stay to live there, because otherwise they would be sent to Komansky Most institution after they become adults, and they would remain there up until the end of their lives. So this is why we believe that this is a transitory solution, developing this form of services, and then later, of course, we'll try to provide services for independent functioning and living in the community. The same situation is for the daycare centers for children with disabilities. The idea was, so we were trying to follow the European guidelines to develop these kinds of services, because these children were stigmatized. These children were staying in their homes. They would be usually just stay there. They would not leave their homes. But through the huge campaigns that we have organized previously, we managed to change the state of mind of people. So these children are going now to the daycare centers for children with disabilities, so that their parents can work, dedicate their time to their professions, and also so that their children can socialize and be with other children who have disabilities. So this is not an educational service, this is a social service that is assisting to the parents so that they can continue to live their own lives and also to take care of the children during the day. Of course, we cannot, so it would not be rational to have daycare centers in each and every town in Montenegro, but in smaller towns of Montenegro, we wish to make this service available to all of the children that have the need to receive such form of care and protection. Thank you. Good day to all of you. I shall try to answer to the questions which are related to the education of teachers for use of brailles, of course, to get, and also when it comes to working with children who are attending inclusive education. So yesterday I mentioned this, and I wanted to complete what I said, but I need to go back to the reform of the previous special schools and transforming them into the resource centers. So we have 3 resource centers. One of them is in Podgorica and is covering, actually it's working with children with who are visually impaired. So in order to reach this whole area of training of teachers to use brailles, I think it would be a good idea to say first that besides this, in order to, in a high-quality manner, work with these children within regular elementary education. We, up to a large extent, put a focus on preschool education as well. So, in the last 3 to 4 years, our colleagues from the Resource Center Podgorica, who is in charge for this area, as I already said, we have organized trainings in all of the kindergartens in Montenegro. So 21 kindergartens for 360 educators or professional associates or pedagogues, psychologists, and also representatives of NGOs. These were usually associations of parents of children with disabilities. So we focused on early interventions, not only how to work with these children in order to come to the area of trainings for Braille. So we need to cover at an early age these so-called pre-reading skills, as they are called. And when we speak about training of teachers at the elementary level to use Brailles, I need to share with you that these trainings are accredited. They are approved by the National Council because these are the requirements that we need to fulfill in order to, in a valid and adequate manner, work within the system of education system. So these trainings for Brailles was organized in 8 elementary schools, Podgorica, Bijelo Polje, Danilovgrad, and Herceg Novi, for 108 participants of these trainings. What is important to mention is that representatives of the Resource Center Podgorica, through mobile activities, are visiting schools where vision impaired children are going and attending education, and together with children, we develop individual educational programs and then provide recommendations when it comes to organization of teaching, not only to achieve academic achievements, but also developmental achievements of these children. And what is important to mention is that all of this is connected with the Braille's training and preparation and printing of school books in Braille's, which is being done together with the Institute for Writing and Publishing of School Books. So we usually give 2 sets of these school books. One stays at school and the other one stays at home of these children, because we know how huge these school books in Braille's are. So in order to not impair the movement of these children, we give 2 sets to each child. And also in the resource center, lately we have started with developing of these specialized school books and also establishment of the so-called assistive schoolroom. Also, besides the right to of the child to learn Braille's, lately, in cooperation with UNICEF, starting from 2015, we have started to intensively transform or translate the school books into so-called DAISY format. So in the 50 schools, we have organized trainings first for 109 participants. So they were teachers of Montenegrin language and literature, and then also for teachers, ICT coordinators of schools who attended these trainings in order to apply the information technology elements, and also we had representatives of parents. In the second phase, we also included 125 participants, so 50 schools, and we are working for 3 years already regarding translation of the school books into the DAISY format. And what is also value when you focus on inclusive education is that it's not only that vision impaired children get benefits from these activities. Actually, we managed to cover a broader spectrum, so like dyslexia, dysgraphia. So DAISY format school books are highly beneficial for these children, children with intellectual disabilities, etc., etc. So thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't skip anything, but if I did, I will add later. Good day to all of you. My name is Dalibor Milošević from the Ministry of Transport. And in a few sentences, I will try to say what the government of Montenegro, Ministry of Transport, is doing when it comes to accessibility in transport. First of all, I would like to point out that when we speak about air and maritime transport, the government of Montenegro is a signee of all of the international conventions and is applying all of them. So when it comes to accessibility in these forms of transport, we are harmonized fully and we do not have any huge challenges there. When we speak about railway transport, unfortunately, we cannot say the same. So when speaking about accessibility to facilities, public facilities and buildings in the railway transport and train stations, I'll not speak too much about this because my colleague here explained yesterday how reconstruction and construction of these facilities and buildings is being done and what standards needs to be adhered to, and how the controls of adherence to these standards is being performed. But when we speak about the vehicles themselves, the trains themselves, they cannot be adjusted to these international standards, unfortunately. But when we buy new trains, we take this into account, and when we procured 3 new trains a few years ago, they are fully accessible and fulfill all of the standards of accessibility. Also in this area, I would like to mention that in 2018 and 2019 we will draft new regulations in the area of railway transport, and this sector will have the possibility to take part into the drafting process of these regulations when it comes to harmonization with the standards and with the convention. When we speak about road transport, the situation is most complex because all of the services in the road transport are provided by the private sector, and Ministry of Transport, having in mind the business environment, imposes the obligation to service providers. In order to fulfill these standards of accessibility, they should adhere to the standards, and one of the examples is the new law on road transport, through which we introduced certain measures which focus on provision of services at the bus stations, and one of the requirements for obtaining the license for a bus station is that they need to adhere to all of the standards when it comes to accessibility. So each bus station which does not fulfill these requirements will not be able to perform their activities and get the license for provision of services. When we speak about taxi transportation, we made a step ahead, so there is an obligation that local governances need, through their decision to determine the minimum amount of taxi vehicles which need to be made accessible to persons with disabilities. When it comes to public transport in municipalities, things are a lot simpler because we announce public tender for these services, so it is possible to stimulate local governments so that one of the parameters in tenders is actually to adhere to the standards of accessibility, and I think that 2 local governments are already working on this, and maybe they are already at the implementation level. And when it comes to intermunicipal or intercity transport, we have applied for a grant to draft a study to improve intercity transport of passengers, and it will include also the topic of accessibility, where we will find a model to stimulate and raise awareness among the private sector and providers of these services regarding accessibility in these forms of transport, to try to stimulate them to change their vehicles in accordance with the required standards. Also, I would like to point out that in the part of public parking space, the law and municipal decisions prescribe the percentage of minimum parking spaces reserved for persons with disabilities, and head of delegation already mentioned this in the introductory part, so there is no need to spend any more time. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm here for you.
Dear colleagues, I will just use this opportunity to briefly add up on what my colleague Tamara said when it comes to the accessibility in accessible formats for the visually impaired persons, and the accessibility in accessible formats has been exercised through the program of protection of cultural goods, within which we provided for the financial support of the Ministry of Culture in issuing and publishing the magazines intended for the visually impaired. A library for the blind also included and focused in the previous period on the needs of visually impaired and other persons, and the activities on the publication and issuing of books, and there is also the postal services and home delivery of these books. The publishing activity of this institution is related to issuing books in formats adaptable to the visually impaired persons, audio formats, and also Braille's alphabet. I will also provide you with a couple of data related to the accessibility of buildings used by the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Interior. I have to admit that no buildings of the Ministry of Justice are technically fully adapted to the persons with disabilities. However, when it comes to the building of the Directorate for Misdemeanor and Criminal Records and the Directorate for Parole, it is located on the ground floor where these directorates are accommodated, so this is how the criterion of accessibility is met. We should also point to provision 238, paragraph 3, which provides that the witnesses who, because of severe bodily deficiencies or age, cannot be heard at the court, will be heard as witnesses in their homes. Also, we should point to the access ramp before the basic court in Podgorica, the largest court in Montenegro, which provides for access of persons with disabilities, and we should also indicate that there is provided access for persons with disabilities to the Supreme Court of Montenegro. And when it comes to the buildings used by the Ministry of Interior, the police premises for retaining in the police administration of the Ministry of Interior's Security Center in Podgorica has the access ramp and the rooms for detaining persons with disabilities. Also, the Ministry of Justice, the Office for Enforcement of Criminal Sanctions, the short sentence prison in Bielopolje, provides the conditions for access to all the rooms for convicts with disabilities using wheelchair. On the other hand, the sanitary rooms and bathrooms are not accessible in this prison. So that's it for the time being. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Montenegro for giving us such a such comprehensive answers to our second round of questions, and this opens the third round of questions on Article 21 to 33. So the floor is open for the third round of questions, and my first speaker is Mr. Langvad. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I have one follow-up question regarding accessibility, because when I was listening to the information provided by the representative from the Ministry of Transport, I came upon the thought that it seems as if you are not aware of the fact that since 2001 there has been an obligation within the European Union to provide accessible buses within the municipalities, and it is an obligation that is mandatory, and it seems to me as if you are negotiating with the private sector to ask them to live up to this commitment. And I would like to know if you are not having a mandatory legislation providing for accessible buses within the cities. Secondly, I would like to know in which way you are measuring the standard of living, the income, the disability-related expenses for persons with disabilities and their families who are those that are not subject to public services, so those that are supposed to be managing by themselves without the support of the public, no, from the state. Thirdly, I would like to know in which way you are negotiating involving persons with disabilities into international cooperation, both when you are dealing with countries, state parties in your region, but also when we are dealing with state parties which are belonging to the European Union. And last, I would like to know if you have a strategic plan for the full implementation of the CRPD into your national legislation and regulations, and which kind of indicators you have for living up to the strategy, if such a strategy is existing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Langvad. The next three speakers are Mr. Martin, Mr. Ishikawa, Mr. Buntan. Mr. Martin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the members of the delegations for your answers to our questions. Article 21. Can people with an intellectual disability vote in your country, and why not? Because really they are also citizens of your country. They were born there, so they're therefore citizens of your country. Article 23. 21, sorry. Do you have any plans to make easy read information for citizens of your country who have intellectual disabilities, and also people that don't have Montenegro language as well? So people that come into your country and speak a different language. Article 23, can you please tell me if people with intellectual disabilities are allowed to get married in your country? If they are not, please can you explain why this is the case? Because I can tell you, I have been married, well, next year for 30 years, so people with intellectual disabilities can get married and can have relationships. Article 25. I have heard that forced sterilisation is still allowed in your country. Can you please tell me if this is correct? If this is correct, I would like to know why you think this is okay. In Article 30, in what ways do people with all disabilities take part in the media in your country, like the production, direction of programs and the training of people who work in the media? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Mr. Ishikawa, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions about higher education for this round. However, before asking them, I would like you to confirm your challenge regarding my question about Article 5, because not only myself, but also DPOs of Montenegro are concerned with it. First, I acknowledge the effort of the government of Montenegro to establish the law on the prohibition of discrimination of persons with disabilities. However, it seems to me that it is not fully in line with the convention. As I pointed yesterday, Article 18 of that law stipulates only physical inaccessibility among all types of inaccessibility is a form of discrimination unless provision of accessibility is disproportionate and undue burden. However, state parties have obligation to ensure that denial of provision of any kind of reasonable accommodation is a form of discrimination, and it must be prohibited by any effective measure. May I ask you to confirm that you have the challenge? Next is questions about education, higher education. Is the exam to be qualified to go to higher education accessible to blind students? Can blind students take exam in Braille? The second question is sign language interpreters and note takers, are they provided to deaf students and students with hearing impairment? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ishikawa. Mr. Buntan, and after Mr. Buntan, I have Mr. Shakir, Mr. Rukledev, and Mr. Basharu. Mr. Buntan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I do have a few questions as follow-up. The first one is from issue of accessibility. Yesterday, I did ask about the procurement, public procurement law, which requires accessibility, whether that exists, and I got the answer this morning that you've got Article 50 of Public Procurement Law. Unfortunately, what I know is that such law, which was enacted in 2011, Article 50 of that law removed the accessibility requirement recently in July 2017. So I'm wondering whether you would have anything of that kind be restored so as to ensure that any public procurement would require accessibility as it used to be since 2011, and unfortunately removed this July. The second is I heard a lot of good things about Braille and alternative accessible format of books and information, but I'd like to know the legal status, whether it is a legal status of sign language, Braille, easy read, or information for the official interaction in accessible modes, means, and format of communications. I would like to also ask, since I've heard from civil society, particular DPOs, that most students with disabilities are mainly educated up to secondary level, and I'm wondering if there are any well-established support service system to enable persons with disabilities in the tertiary education. And my last question would be tied to Article 4.3 and Article 33.3 regarding the role of organizations of persons with disabilities in the formulation, implementation, and monitoring of policies and laws affecting their lives. From what I know, throughout your presentation, you mentioned the term NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, repeatedly. I understand that. Of course, DPOs are also a subset of NGOs in general, but we have a specific quality, specific infrastructure, specific formulation of organizations of persons with disabilities that must be democratically represented by persons with disabilities. So I'm wondering if you have a legal requirement for organizations of persons with disabilities to be actively involved and to participate fully and effectively in order to ensure effective and full enjoyment of persons with disabilities to the public policies and laws concerning the lives. And if you have systematically provided financial, technical, and or other means to help enable persons with disabilities through their representative organizations to participate in such arena. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a joyful and safe trip back to your lovely country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shakir, please.
I am going to ask you, my dear guest, on the employment of persons with disabilities. And for us, this is a very, very important matter. We can be, as you see, educated, or we can have accessibility, we can have reasonable accommodation, but if we don't have a job, we will feel ourselves as just nothing. That's why I would like to ask you, please, to provide information on the percentage of persons with disabilities in formal employment, both in the public sector and private companies, and please indicate whether there is legislation to protect the labor rights of persons with disabilities, and whether it provides for protection against dismissal on grounds of disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Ruklide, please.
I'd like to thank the representatives of Montenegro for their detailed answers. But following on from your answers to my previous questions on Articles 4 and 8, I have understood that in Montenegro there's low partnership and consultation between the state and national organizations for the deaf. And so I hope that my colleagues from the committee will support me in this, and I would like to ask you also to clarify the information on Article 24. How much does the education process for the deaf provide for the use of sign language? And are universities in Montenegro and their trainers trained in the use of sign language? Do those teachers improve their level of qualification by studying modern methods for the teaching of deaf children, including with the use of sign language and with the use of modern assistive technologies? What number of deaf students study in the higher education and vocational education systems, and are they given sign language interpretation services, and if so, who pays for that? On Article 29, do persons with disabilities and their organizations participate in the political and public life in Montenegro? Are there deputies with disabilities in the Montenegrin parliament? To what extent are voting places adapted and accessible, and to what extent is political material available to them? Are television debates or statements made by politicians translated with sign language interpretation? On Article 30, to what extent are sports facilities in Montenegro accessible to persons with disabilities, and how possible is it for children with disabilities to engage in sport? Are there state programs available to develop adapted sport? What sports events exist for persons with disabilities that are conducted regularly in Montenegro? What measures are taken in Montenegro to allow persons with disabilities to develop their creative, artistic and intellectual potential, which could also be used to enrich all of society. Thank you very much for coming here today and working with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Basharo, please. And after Mr. Basharo, I have Mr. Al-Saif, Mr. Ruskus, and Mr. Tutic.
Madam Chair, Article 21 is just a quick follow-up on what my colleague said, Montian. Apart from knowing the status of Braille in the state party, do blind persons have access to text in Braille? Are they given requisite training to equip them with skills in Braille? Are there sufficient teachers to teach the Braille code? And furthermore, what is the allocation of time in the electronic media for dissemination of information to deaf persons using sign language interpretation? On health, a large proportion of the report on health is based on prevention of diseases or disability, which is of course incompatible with the provisions of the convention that talks about the rights of persons with disabilities. Could the state party inform explicitly about the provisions of an accessible environment for persons with disabilities to access the healthcare system, including a provision of information in accessible formats like Braille, sign language, and easy read for persons with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities? Article 29, political participation, another follow-up on Mr. Rodcliffe's question. Besides providing accessible voting for blind persons, in what other ways are persons with disabilities enabled to participate effectively in the electoral process before, during and after elections, with particular reference to deaf persons and persons with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities? And on monitoring and implementation, Article 33, could the state party unambiguously state which are the focal points in the country for the implementation of the convention, and which is the independent monitoring mechanism, as well as the role of organization of persons with disabilities in the process? Please also inform on the financial outlay available for such focal points and independent monitoring mechanisms to carry out their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Basharo. Mr. Al-Saif, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for delegation of the Montenegro for their answers. I have a couple of questions. First, concerning Article 27, is there any data or information on the number and amount of fines applied in accordance with the penalty provisions of Article 29 of the law on prohibition of discrimination against persons with disabilities? The other questions regarding Article 31. Is there any comprehensive and accessible database on persons with disabilities available for the public? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruskus, please.
Madam Chair, I would like first to second and to complement my colleague Robert Martin on Article 23. Neither family law, nor law on social or child protection, nor law on prohibition of discrimination of persons with disability provide for specific measures for providing support to exercise parental rights for persons with disabilities and then of persons with disabilities, including adoption of children and foster care. I would be happy to hear your comments on that. On Article 24, in 2008, the government of Montenegro adopted a strategy for inclusive education. I would like to know, how do you monitor implementation of the strategy? How successfully children with disabilities enroll and learn in mainstream schools? How many children with disabilities still are in the specialized and segregated settings? How do you ensure the reasonable accommodation in mainstream schools? On Article 26, children with disabilities are still discriminated on the basis of the kind of disability, degree of impairment and age when it comes to rehabilitation, health protection and technical aids because of predetermined criteria and not individual needs. Children with disabilities have right to medical rehabilitation once per year or once in 2 years for duration of 21 days. What measures the state plans to provide rehabilitation for all children with disabilities from the earliest age according to their individual needs? And I would like to second and complete my colleague Mr. Ukledev on Article 13. How equally persons, athletes with disabilities are supported to participate in municipality level or high-level sports, how equally with other athletes with disabilities, and how equally without athletes, athletes without disabilities are supported in sport events in municipality level and high level, including how equally athletes with disabilities are awarded for their achievements. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Tadic, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, first of all, veliko hvala delegaciji.
Thank you very much, Delegation of Montenegro, for your answers.
And I was really satisfied with your statements, so much that I have rearranged my questions for today. And I have 3 follow-up questions related to, in response to what honorable members of delegation spoke this morning, and then I have only 1 question left out of the cluster. These first 2 follow-up questions deal with Article 9 accessibility. You know how much I'm fond of that one. I was very happy to hear from the honorable representative of Ministry in charge of public transport about the plans to make bus transport accessible. Of course, I very much second what my dear friend and colleague Stig Langvad has asked them, and I would like to sort of expand on what he says. I would like to hear what are the deadlines for removal of barriers at bus stations, which you have referred to in your statement, and I would like to know at this moment what is the percentage of accessible buses in public transport in Montenegro, both intercity and at least in some of the major cities of your country. Second one goes to the colleague who was speaking about the accessibility for internet site, and of course access to ICT is very important, and many of my dear friends and colleagues from committee addressed the issue. I would like to ask what are the budgets you have prepared for the planned accessibility of internet sites, and do you have any plan with deadlines when all the websites, at least the ones that are managed by the government and other public authorities of Republic of Montenegro and maybe some local authorities, is there any plan with deadlines when those websites will be fully accessible? And I would like to seek clarification about Article 13. There you said that a deaf person is first submits a written statement if he or she is party to the proceeding. Since Convention, especially in Article 21, is very clear that persons with disabilities have the right to communicate in their preferred means, modes and methods of communication. I would like to ask you, is it under procedural law possible for a deaf person who is party to a proceeding if, for example, judge or investigating magistrate demands that person to submit a written statement, that that person refuse that and ask instead to use the services of the qualified sign language interpretation? That's something I would like to know. And if the law indeed says that first it's written and then sign language interpretation just as an alternative at the end, do you have any plans to change the laws regulating procedures as if to promote further the law on the use of sign language? And last but not least is the typical question which I always have, and I ask each and every country, and this time of course I have the advantage of being many times to Montenegro and your beautiful coast side. So since this interactive dialogue is a chance for you to promote yourselves to the world, because we are also in the webcast and people are following us. Please share more information about the accessibility of tourist and cultural venues in your beautiful country, and especially because I know the time is short and we have asked you many questions. And if you maybe can direct us some website where we can get that type of information. And also in terms of, because we know that happens in some of the countries, hotel advertise itself on their website that they are accessible. Has there been any monitoring to make sure that those hotels that advertise themselves as really accessible are really accessible or not, and are the organizations of persons with disabilities maybe involved in that type of monitoring? And with all that, I thank you very much, and I hope that you will make good use of our concluding observations once we send them to you, and I wish you a very safe journey home, and of course warmest greetings to everybody watching us. Srdačan pozdrav svim kolegicama I kolegama.
Cordial salute to all of the colleagues in Montenegro who are following us via internet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Para, Mr. Para. And after Mr. Para, I have Mr. Kim, Mr. Kabui. Before I give the floor back to the country rapporteur, I have some questions myself. And since time is short, I request that we try to be short and precise. Thank you.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, some questions that I prepared have been already asked. And to simplify, I'd like to ask a question related to Article 24. And I already asked this question addressing other delegations. I'd like to ask the distinguished delegation on inclusive education, especially in connection with the challenges that the implementation of Article 24 faces. And I know there's some very good intentions to implement inclusive education, and Mr. Ruskos already asked a question along these lines, but we have to keep in mind that in our committee we approved General Comment number 4 that establishes 4 models of education: inclusive, segregated education, and others. And I'd like to find out, when do you plan to ensure definitive transition to inclusive education, something that will be real? And what steps are you planning to take to eliminate segregated forms of education? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kim.
Also, distinguished delegation for your dialoguing with us this morning. 2 questions from Article 27 and 32. In reporting on Article 27, you have indicated that you have drafted and adopted at least some 7 bylaws and ordinances for purposes of strengthening employment of persons with disabilities. I don't have to list what those ordinances are. Could you please inform the committee to what extent you have been effective in implementing the ordinances resulting in improvement in the employment of the persons with disabilities? Also, your labor law specifies a special protection to an employee with a disability. For example, persons with disabilities cannot be assigned to work in another place outside of his place of residence. I think this is a bona fide violation of Article 19, personal freedom of choice and movement. Why should they be subjected to this kind of protective measures? What is the ground for your justification for this? Regarding equal pay and equal work, to what extent you are achieving the objective of guaranteeing equal pay for equal work or work with equal values? Do you have any data on this one? Last one on Article 27, the law on professional rehabilitation and employment of persons with disabilities stipulate that a person with disability shall be employed under the general or special conditions, such as the employer that has 20 or 50 employees is required to employ at least one person with disability, or at least 50% of people with disabilities in relation to total number of employees. Would you have any data indicating how well you're achieving this objective? What about employers who may not abide by these legal requirements? Are there any penalties for the failure to comply with this? Moving on to Article 32. The Article 32 of the Convention specifies or stresses that the importance of partnership with the international and regional organizations, in particular with representative organizations of persons with disabilities, to ensure inclusiveness and accessible to persons with disabilities. This prompts me to pose a question to you. I'd like to ask, what about persons with disabilities and their organizations do participate and indeed included in the actual process of international cooperation? For example, are they involved in identifying and developing and also implementing and also evaluating disability inclusive projects? How does your international cooperation is used as an instrument, for example, to achieve some of the SDG objectives, such as Sustainable Development Goals, Target 10.2, or to create employment for persons with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kabui, please.
Thank you very much, Madam. And once again, it's good to interact with you, the delegation from Montenegro. I have a few questions, very short ones. In relation to Article 21, you have talked about different methods of communications, but I have not heard anything to do with the Marrakesh Treaty, which is supposed to enable people with the print disability and visual impairment to access materials in alternative formats. Are there plans for any work on the Marrakesh Treaty, ratifying it and implementing it? My other question relates to Article 23. Article 23, in your paragraph 114 in the response to a list of issues, you have indicated that a solution has been found in regard to marriages, to deal with the issues of marriage. But you have said that the Ministry of Justice has no information on what has taken place in removing the law that prohibited people under guardianship to marry. Can you please explain how this would be that one ministry would not be aware of what is happening? On Article 24 on education, paragraph 117, you have indicated that in relation to inclusive education, the education of people with disabilities would be oriented towards vocational training. I'm not sure that I understand this. Does this mean that there are no plans for people with disabilities to go beyond technical vocational education? And what are the plans, or what strategies are in place to support students in the tertiary institutions of education? In relation to employment, you have stated that in Article the Article 29 of the non-discrimination law, there are penalties prescribed for people who discriminate against people with disabilities in employment. I would like you to give us examples of cases where people have been prosecuted and faced with these penalties and sanctions. There is also the issue of the employment agent running a fund that is expected to create employment for people with disabilities. You have said that the funds for this is through contribution of employers who do not meet the quota. How is this fund operating and how does it create employment? My final question relates to Article 28 on adequate standards of living. I can see that the disability allowance in Montenegro is 111, euros, and I can also see that there's possibilities for people with disabilities to be accorded housing. Who is normally accorded, because it says may be accorded, and what criteria is given to accord them housing? And these 111, is it possible to make a person live in an adequate standard of living? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have some follow-up questions really, and two new questions. Follow-up questions relating to Article 10 on the right to life and the prevention of torture, Article 15, Article 14, right to liberty, and Article 19, right to independent living and living in the community. And it all circles around institutionalization, which it appears to me that it is the biggest challenge in Montenegro when it comes to the implementation of the CRPD. The question is there any special protocol for allegations of abuse in all hospitals, in particularly after death? We have some information about deaths of people with disabilities because of suffocation, and is there any protocol for autopsy, obligatory autopsy after death of people with disabilities in institutions? Chemical and physical restraints seem to be allowed in hospital, whether psychiatric or not, and you know that it may amount to torture and ill treatment, and what measures are taken within maybe the national mechanism national mechanism for prevention of torture to get rid of these mechanisms. Then you have just Mrs. Kirkovac from the Health Ministry has reported on the new hospital who is going to be built, and that there is in that hospital going to be one department for convicted persons with disabilities. And I would like to take note of our guidelines on Article 14, in which we say that special departments for convicted persons with disabilities is not in line with CRPD, that we wish that people with disabilities who are convicted have all the rights a person who is convicted or is arrested has. And we find that in these special forensic departments, often disabled people are deprived all of their justice rights. And in addition, I would like to ask you to take note of our forthcoming General Comment number 5 on Article 19, in which it says that no matter how severe or how perceived dangerous someone is, institutionalization per se is not in compliance with the CRPD, and we all need to go a step further and take action and find other ways. And the investment in deinstitutionalization is the best prevention for violation of other rights under the Convention. A follow-up to Article 16. According to the replies of the list of issues, there are multidisciplinary teams established in all centers for social work in accordance with the law on the protection against domestic battery. And then there is also a free helpline for victims of domestic battery. What is the mandate of the multidisciplinary teams established in the centers of social work, and how do they provide support and assistance to women and children with disabilities in particular? And what measures will the state take in order to protect all women and girls with disabilities and children with disabilities against all types of exploitation, violence, and abuses? I have heard that the free helpline is not accessible to persons with hearing and or speech impairment. How will the state ensure that such tools can be effectively used by all persons with disabilities? Relating to Article 25, the right to health, and especially the right to reproductive and sexual health rights for women with disabilities, is of particular concern to me, and I've heard that medical services are not accessible for women with disability. In particularly, there are almost no gynecological chairs accessible for women with disabilities. What are the plans to remedy that problem? Relating to Article 31, are you planning to adopt the short set of questions of the Washington Group on statistics for your national household censuses? That would be great. And finally, relating to Article 32 and 37, the committee offers technical cooperation to countries who identify fields or areas where technical cooperation is wished, and please notify us if you are interested in that. Thank you so much, and now I turn the floor to the country rapporteur, Mr. Lawashi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your dedicated and precise and helpful answers. Let me begin by putting forward a follow-up question in relation to the so-called lottery fund, because as far as I know, and I was informed by the civil society, that the Commission responsible for reallocation of the resources of that lottery fund doesn't exist anymore. And please comment on this development or pieces of information. With regard to Article 21, I'd like to know whether there are concrete legal obligations and binding roadmaps in order to increase the amount of subtitling, captioning in both private and public media. In relation to Article 24, the State Party confirms that around 90 education institutions have adjusted access. Toilets were adapted in around 60 schools, and around 10 have lifts, elevators. And but wondering whether what the general picture regarding the education, the number of education institutions in the country. According to the civil society, the state hasn't published concrete results and measurable effects, outputs of the strategy on inclusive education, and perhaps you may make some comments on this or inform us about the availability of these figures and concrete figures. With regard to Article 27, I'm wondering whether during the examination of persons with disability, apart from medical doctors, what kind of experts usually consult the clients in question at the first level of the procedure, and what legal remedies are available after the decision of the second level? In relation to the subsidy provided after employees, as far as I know, up to 2011, the upper limit of the financial framework was around €2,700 a year, as I assume. This upper limit was removed recently, and I'd like to know what happened since. With regard to the with regard to the unemployment level of persons with disabilities, I'd like to know the general and overall situation in terms of unemployment level of persons with disabilities. I think I was able to cover almost everything, but except Article 33. Please explain whether you mentioned the fact that you mentioned in the 162 of reply to this list of issues, there is a team formed to evaluate the implementation of the relevant strategy in terms of the implementation of the Convention. Please explain how it will fulfill the relevant obligation enshrined in the Convention and whether this team can be considered as a part of one or more independent bodies and mechanisms at the level of the government. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to receiving your precise answers.
That exhausts our list of questions. Again, a lot. I'm very sorry. We break for 15 minutes now so that the distinguished delegation of Montenegro can organize its answers to our many questions. Thank you. 15 minutes break. Welcome back. I give the floor to the head of delegation, Minister Kusevja, for answering our questions, and I apologize for leaving not so much time to you. Please finish your answers by 56 or 55 so that we can have a concluding response. And I beg the indulgence of the interpreters again for asking again for a 2 minutes extension so that the country rapporteur can also have a final statement. Thank you.
Thank you. When it comes to the accessibility in transport, there was a question on whether there is an obligatory norm for the city buses in municipal transportation, for obliging the buses to be accessible. I have to say that in parallel with this, there was another question related to public procurement, Article 50. This Article 50 still exists in the new law from 2017, and it provides for the obligation or the duty of each contractor to meet the technical requirements and for them to be included in the tender documents, which means that for city buses these technical requirements must be prescribed as well. Also, the rule book on special conditions prescribed by the Ministry of Transport provides for the possibility for the existing buses for which this is possible to be adapted when it comes to accessibility and installing platforms. The next question was related to the deadlines for the bus stations that needed to be regulated by the bylaw. So the law on road transport is a new law from which bylaws will stem and which we need to do in the following quarter. And on this occasion I would like to invoke the NGO sector, to call the NGO sector to get involved in this. And I can say that these deadlines will be reasonably short because in the previous period we issued some recommendations, and of these recommendations only 2 or 3 bus stations did this. So this time we will have reasonably short deadlines, and this will be an obligation within the full meaning of the word. And finally, when it comes to the percentage of buses that are accessible, I have to say that I unfortunately do not have this data with me, and even if I did, it would not be impressive, I will be honest. So I owe you this information. And I would just like to note also that the Ministry of Transport has a law on the contracts in road transport, and based on that law and the law on transportation, we will now introduce a license of professional drivers where we are going to train the drivers, and this training will also include a module on this field, the field of access of persons with disabilities. Thank you. Hello everyone. I will try to answer a large group of questions. First of all, I would like to comment on accessibility in public transport by saying that the law on prohibition of discrimination of persons with disabilities has also recognized discrimination in the field of public transportation and prescribed high fines for perpetrators of this discrimination, amounting to 10,000 to 20,000 euros if it is a legal entity that committed the violation, or 500 to 2,000 euros if this violation was done by a responsible person in the legal entity. And finally, an entrepreneur can be imposed from 500 to 6,000 euros for discrimination in public transportation. As for the other questions, there was also maybe the question of reasonable adaptation in anti-discrimination legislation. I yesterday stated that reasonably adaptation is defined through the general law on prohibition of discrimination in Article 18, which says, and this is the truth, that the first paragraph relates to the inaccessibility of buildings in public use for the persons with reduced mobility. However, this paragraph was, which of course recognizes the reasonable adaptation, and this recognizes as discrimination on the basis of this adaptation. But we forgot the second paragraph of the provision saying that the discrimination of persons with disabilities also exists in the case where no special measures have been taken for elimination of the unequal position in which these persons are found. So it's a very broad provision, and even if there was no clear formulation in this of this discrimination based on the reasonable adaptation in our anti-discrimination legislation, the Constitution clearly stipulates that ratified international treaties are an integral part of the Montenegrin legal order, and they have primacy over national legislation when it comes to when they regulate things differently than the domestic legislation. So there is a very clear legal safeguard here, and I don't think there exists any legal uncertainty when it comes to this question. One of the questions was also related to the strategic plan for full implementation of the UN Convention and the type of activities we are planning to implement the Convention of the United Nations. From yesterday's answers, you could see that Montenegro has adopted the analysis of the alignment or harmonization of the legislation to the law on the Convention of the United Nations and the law on anti-discrimination, where the topic of the analysis were 60 regulations from the areas defined by the Convention. This analysis found 34 regulations with the recommendation for alignment. So the second part of the document adopted by the government of Montenegro in December 2016 is monitoring the implementation of the recommendations from the analysis. So this is just one of the measures defined in the strategy for the protection of persons with disabilities from discrimination, on top of all the other measures related to promotion of equality and establishing or achieving the implementation of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disability. I would also like to remind you that Montenegro, or specifically the Ministry for Human and Minority Rights, also established a commission for monitoring the strategy for protecting persons with disabilities from discrimination, composed of the representatives of the civil society and state administration, which will be monitoring the implementation of all of these measures from the defined in the strategy. And also one of the questions was about the indicators. The indicators are monitoring the implementation of all of these measures that were recognized through alignment of regulations and through various training activities, campaigns to achieve full equality of persons with disability with other citizens. One other question related to whether there were any sanctions for discrimination in the field of employment. The law on protection from discrimination also includes labor relations and prescribes the same fines for or sanctions for discrimination in the employment area, the same sanctions I just read recently. There was also a question about the number of cases before different institutions for protection of human rights. Yesterday I tried to familiarize you with this situation. When it comes to the anti-discrimination mechanisms, the Ombudsperson's Office is recognized as an institutional mechanism for protection from discrimination, and according to the Ombudsperson's Office, on average, there is 6 complaints a year based on discrimination of persons with disability. We hope that in the coming period this trend will be on the increase when it comes to the number of reports. When it comes to other bodies, the civil courts in Montenegro in the period from 2013 to 16, there were 7 proceedings for protection from discrimination. In 2016, there were also 7, and before the Supreme State Prosecutor's Office there were no criminal proceedings. Before the High Court for misdemeanors there were also no cases. Before the Inspectorate for Inspection Affairs there were 2 cases for protection from discrimination. Also, I maybe forgot to mention yesterday that this year we already have 6 cases pending for protection from discrimination, which is a positive signal given the fact that we are now at the half of the year. Now, when it comes to the participation of persons with disabilities in political life, I will tell you that the Ministry for Human and Minority Rights, together with the Association of Youth with Handicap in Montenegro, implemented a pilot project which enabled the visual and hearing impaired to have secret vote using an adapted form in the last presidential election. And this pilot project has shown all the advantages of this approach that the person with disability can utilize in the process of independent vote. Also, the Association of the Youth with Handicap, together with the Action for Human Rights, continued with initiatives for amendments to the law on election of councillors and MPs, and the amendments have created the conditions for the electoral places and the entire election process to be adapted to the persons with disabilities, regardless of the type of disability. And this was implemented in 14 municipalities for the first time at the local elections in 2014. Also, the analysis of legislation, of harmonization of legislation in Montenegro with the law on election of MPs and councillors were recognized as partly implemented regulations. They received the recommendation for full alignment, especially when it comes to deprivation of legal capacity, which needs to be aligned in the coming period with the convention. When it comes to tourism, another thing actually, very important, when it comes to the participation in political life of persons with disabilities, the strategy for protection of persons with disabilities from discrimination also recognizes the political life. And in the coming year, we have, for which we have adopted the action plan, we have recognized campaigns as the activities, as well as conferences that will contribute to an increased participation of persons with disabilities in political life. The law on anti-discrimination also recognizes discrimination on the grounds of participation in political life. So we believe we have a comprehensive legislative framework with additional improvements when it comes to regulations defining the very procedure of election and voting. When it comes to tourism, persons with disabilities, Montenegro is a tourist destination, as you know, and one of the pillars of development of Montenegro is tourism. In this regard, Montenegro is developing, and basically the policy documents of Montenegro recognize as a problem, but also as a challenge for the coming period, tourism and the perspective of the persons with disabilities. In this regard, the National Tourist Organization has implemented training on the topic of preparing the training, the travel plans for persons with disabilities. And in addition, Montenegro is undertaking a lot of activities to regulate what is a very architecturally challenging surrounding, to adapt such a surrounding to persons with disabilities, and to support, and has supported to this end a great number of initiatives to adapt the tourism facilities to persons with disabilities. So when it comes to tourism and persons with disabilities, we can say that we are in line with and there is the obligation to adapt the hotels in line with the law on construction of facilities, and the buildings are being adapted. Now, of course, in Montenegro there is a certain number of hotels which are in line with the accessibility standards and which do enable access to persons with disabilities. On the other hand, there is also, with this support of the Commission for Allocation of the Funds for Games of Chance. There are projects. There is, for example, a guide prepared in the municipality of Kotor, Budva, Cetinje, which is the old royal capital and the cultural and historical center of Montenegro. And there is also the link to which all the interested parties can report the accessibility issues potentially for a certain category of persons with disabilities. I have this link somewhere. I think it's osi.podgorica.me. Also in Google Play you can download an application, osi.info, which was also prepared by the NGO Association of Paraplegicians of Podgorica with the support of the Commission for the Allocation of the Funds of the Games of Chance and other donors. But in any case, tourism is the perspective of Montenegro, and certainly there is room for many more activities in this area. I hope I managed to be efficient and to respond to your questions, and certainly I am at your disposal for any further questions. Thank you.
So we will focus directly on the area of sports. So regarding sports, I think that Mr. Kushchev in the introductory remarks pointed out and mentioned Paralympic sports, which as such was recognized at the national level. And I think among other things, we spoke also about the medals that they won in the previous period. And what is also very important is that at this moment we have the Ministry of Sports, which we did not have for quite a while now. And what is a novelty is that a huge focus is put on this inclusive sports. So I would like to share the information with you regarding Special Olympics, since Special Olympics is focused on persons with intellectual disabilities. So regularly at the national level we have these competitions in these sports, and unfortunately water polo is not among these sports. I'm very sorry about this personally, but there are 7 associations. Regularly 4 to 5 seminars are held each year for trainers, which are focusing on these so-called unified sports. And focus when it comes to Special Olympics is on inclusiveness, and what is one of the last activities is that Special Olympics, in cooperation with the Ministry of Education, has started with the activities of earliest not only involvements of children in these unified sports, but also their, if I may put it like that, recruitment for future achievements. So in 5 kindergartens we have unified activities. We have trained more than 100 educators and we have included more than 150 children. So we have provided them with equipment so that children can start dabbling with inclusive sports from the earliest age. And Special Olympics is regularly involved in Special Olympics. The last ones were in Austria, Winter Paralympics, and we have 75 medals as far as I know at these Special Olympics. The next area that I wanted to provide the answers to is the area of adjustment of educational institutions, and lately we have noticed that people understand the need for adaptation of these educational institutions, but the question is whether it is done according to the criteria and standards. So there is a set of activities undertaken. So we did directions not only when it comes to adaptation of these institutions, but also others which people maybe do not see quite frequently when it comes to, for example, the needs of visually impaired persons. So we did some guidelines starting from architectural approach, but also focusing on approachability of the accessibility of the education process itself. And what we understood is to focus on promotion as well. So we focused on the directors of the educational institutions. So we did some counseling with them. They all drafted action plans how to make their institutions more accessible and more adapted to persons with disabilities. So In 9 of the schools there are elevators, there is a platform in one of them, and platforms are being installed in 3 of the schools. What I feel the need to share with you is that our ministry has inscriptions in Brailles, as well as 4 schools in Montenegro, and specialized teaching books for children with disabilities as well. And what is the next step is that through IPA program is that trying to get the funds that we got to improve the accessibility of the educational system. So we are performing an even deeper analysis to determine the priorities of the schools that will fulfill all of the accessibility requirements. And the next area that I would like to share a few words with you, I have to apologize, but I will just try to provide brief information. This is the area of higher education. What I feel the need to say is that according to the law on higher education, we have prescribed that it is necessary to adjust the tests and teaching methods and provide physical access to PVDs. The courses are free for PVDs, but according to the latest reform, the university courses are free for everyone. So there was also a question regarding exams to enter university. We had them only at several faculties, but the criteria is mostly calculated based on the results of external examination done by the end of the 4th school year at the secondary legislation, but also we have provided the possibility for visually impaired students to take the exam in Brailles and to have an aide present during this examination. And also there is an obligation to have the lectures in Brailles and in sign language. So this is one of the requirements to give the license to an educational institution and to accredit and reaccredit that institution. I currently do not have the data on concrete numbers based on regarding the number of students based on different impairments and disabilities, but I can provide it at a later time. And in the latest amendments to the law through discrimination stipulations, we are focusing even further on these issues. And now strategy of inclusive education. So this is another document. So the first strategy was adopted in 2008 for the period 2008-2013. Currently, we have the strategy for the period 2014-2018. So what are the key results? The key results are, I would like to share with you concrete information. So the number of children with disabilities is 4,667, I believe. And in the resource centers, 1st June, in elementary education we have 37, and resource center 26, Podgorica, and in Kotor 19 children with disabilities. And as I said, their activities are more oriented towards early interventions, and this is where we see a higher number of those who are receiving these services or using these services. We are focusing more on inclusive education. This is an imperative, so I have to say that it's simply a fact that we did not. So we are still referring some of the children to resource center in cases where this is the best interest of those children. But I think that my colleagues from NGO sector know that I am someone who is always promoting inclusive education. This is our final goal. We will like to focus on that in the future and keep decreasing the number of children attending these resource centers. But there is a resistance of people working in these resource centers, but now they are facing the fact that actually the wealth of their jobs is increasing because they are providing support to children in the broadest possible sense. So all of the children are working based on individual educational and developmental programs, which are being improved, which were being improved previously and amended. It was previously more focused on goals and much less on the activities and methods and way how to adjust the work with individuals. Now this was changed, and we also introduced so-called individual transitional programs, which assist us to properly properly organize professional reorientation of these children and make this passing from elementary to secondary school easier. This is a good idea, I believe, because children can make some decisions based on what they want to do in the future, and maybe to focus on the jobs that they want to work in the future. And then later we have transitional programs from when they complete their secondary education. So these children usually choose to attend secondary legislation, vocational education at the secondary level to get trained for their jobs. So we try to focus on certain professions that they prefer, and when it comes to monitoring of strategy is monitored regularly. It has an accompanying action plan, and through meetings with the directors we are regularly checking what they achieved and how they are working. Also because we have the Institute for Education, and together with them we are monitoring regularly how they are drafting these inclusive educational plan based on the index of inclusivity when it comes to education of hearing impaired children. We get the key support from the resource center Kotor, but the people are actually attending regular education. At the moment there are 75 of them. We are putting the focus on early interventions, and they have the right, together with their families, to spend a week or 15 or 20 days, depending on the assessment, with their parents, so that the child can get more independent in the future. We are also providing them assistive technologies, recommendations, etc., etc. I apologize if I skipped some things because of the allocated time, but I will give additional information later. I would like to start with the legislative framework when it comes to professional rehabilitation and employment of persons with disabilities. You know that in 2009 we adopted the law on professional rehabilitation and employment of persons with disabilities, and then 7 pieces of secondary legislation later. All of them are being enforced in order to have a comprehensive process of professional rehabilitation, and this is required in order. We also need to get the rule book on financing of these organizations for employment of persons with disabilities, and the work group has prepared it, but it did not get a positive opinion of the Secretariat for Legislation. We got a recommendation that through amendments of the law on professional rehabilitation and employment of PVDs, we need to further define it. And regarding the Fund for Professional Rehabilitation and its functioning, I would like to mention that the law on professional rehabilitation within the employment agency, we have established a fund for professional rehabilitation as a separate unit, which performs the activities regarding implementation of development policies and improvement of professional rehabilitation and employment of PVDs, financing of professionals who are working in the field of professional rehabilitation, providing subsidies for employment of PVDs, financing of grant schemes, providing financial assistance of those who are providing these services and employing these persons, cooperation with other services in the area of planning and implementation of measures for professional rehabilitation of PVDs. The funds are being provided from contributions paid by employers who did not fulfill this quota when it comes to employment of persons with disabilities. These funds are being paid to the budget of Montenegro, and since the the law started to be enforced up until 2013, these funds were not separated as a special position when it comes to the budget, but the obligations for these obligations, they use the funds for active measures of employment. It needs to be remarked that the funds allocated in the last few years have been significantly decreased, so we had less space for employment active measures of employment of these persons and program content when it comes to these programs. And having in mind the budget allocated for this purpose and the problem that there is no separate position for this fund for professional rehabilitation and employment of PVDs, the law on budget in 2014 for the first time for 2014 has allocated a separate position for training and employment of PVDs. It needs to be said that from 2009 the funds that were spent for this purpose were 135,000 euro, but now in 2017 the fund has 6 million euros, which is a significant improvement. Of course, we should not forget a large part of funds which was paid by the employers and was not used for the intended purpose. And in 2015, the State Audit Institution has published a report on the auditing of the success of use of these funds for professional rehabilitation and employment of PVDs, and has provided certain recommendations in order to get a higher percentage of use of these funds for employment of PVDs. And according with this, Ministry of Labour and Social Welfare, in accordance with the strategy for integration of persons with disabilities, will make an analysis of the use of these funds as a separate legal body, and this analysis will show whether it is whether the Employment Agency of Montenegro needs to separate this, and if the recommendations are focused on are actually vote for making it as like a separate point in the budget, which would define the competencies. We should remark that in this case all of the income would go to not to the budget, but it would go to the fund directly. So this was the case previously. All of the funds went to the budget directly.
One more time, I will try to be as brief as possible for all the questions I recognized as belonging to my field of work. First of all, the question by Mr. Martin, I believe, information provided to the persons with intellectual disabilities and how they are used, how much they are used, how much other languages are used in internet presentations. I can tell you that in the guidelines for the preparation of documents, a separate part is devoted to the preparation of easy to understand language or writing documents in easily understandable languages that can be understood by persons with cognitive and intellectual disorders and disabilities. Also, in the public administration, there is the possibility to use both Cyrillic and Latin alphabet and the English language, and as of recently the minority languages, specifically the Albanian language. Also, Mr. Tatic's question was related to the budget for the planning of internet websites. We know that some technical adaptations depend on whether they are the adaptations for using the screen readers or subtitling of videos. These are very different. This year we allocated 40,000 euros, which may not sound as a lot, but is sufficient given that these enhancements which we are going to do this year will cover all the 55 websites of the state institutions. When it comes to the internet websites of local authorities, we are planning in the coming period to carry out a detailed analysis of all the internet websites of the state institutions and the local government, and then we are going to be able to plan the funds accordingly. So, as I said, by the middle of next year we expect that the website of the government and of these 54 institutions will be accessible to, first of all, screen readers primarily. There was also a question about Article 50 of the law on public procurement. I will confirm, as my colleague said, that this article is still valid, is still in force, because what you saw from June are only the amendments, which is not an integral part of the text. The remaining part of the text is still in force. So we do have the obligation to provide for accessibility standards in these cases. And also when it comes to the NGOs and the question of how much we recognize separately the organizations dealing with persons with disabilities, I can tell you that in June this year, the Parliament has supported and gave a very positive affirmative action for persons with disabilities by recognizing in some crucial laws persons with disabilities and also the projects related to them. So in the latest amendments to the laws on legislation on NGOs, among other things, the country has recognized additional funds, 0.1%, to be used by persons with disabilities organizations. Also some other laws such as the law on higher education, a law on vocational rehabilitation, professional rehabilitation law on gender equality, etc. also have this affirmative approach when it comes to persons with disabilities. And this is what I had to say. When it comes to the comment by Mr. Tatic, if I understood him well, related to the plans in connection with the use of sign language in the judicial proceedings, it is important to note that in 2018 we planned the amendments to the law on non-judicial proceedings. So in this period we are going to take into account also the what you said. When it comes to the marriage and establishing a family, the family law says that the marriage is entered into through consent of a man and a woman given before the competent authorities and in accordance with the law. So in order to be able to marry, you need consent of the future spouses. So the prohibition you indicated is not related to all the persons with disabilities, but only to those who, due to mental illnesses, are not able to judge things reasonably and give consent. As for the media and accessible content, Montenegro is allocating certain funds without discrimination for the program contents which are important for the development of education and science, development of culture, and informing persons with visual and hearing impairments. Also, the law on electronic media says that the Council is obliged to encourage the users of media services to make their services accessible to persons with visual and hearing impairments. That's it from me. Thank you. If you allow me, just a couple of more things, and this will wrap up our today's address to the committee. The Marrakesh Agreement question, I have to say that the Marrakesh Agreement is being considered within the negotiation chapter regulating intellectual property, and certainly this committee will receive information on this. Also, the question was whether the disability allowance, personal disability allowance amounting to 115 euros a month in Montenegro is sufficient to make a living. They also receive 65 euros for the care by other person. They also use the subsidies for electricity and other rights. So the minimum amount is 24 euros. So within the family there are different allowances, such as the compensation for the guardian and parent also, which amounts to 193 euros. So, and if there is a child accommodated in a daycare, in a day center for children with disabilities, this is 150 euros. So all of this together amounts to 570 euros. And I also have to say that the material allowance for the families with 5 and more members without regular income amounts to 125 euros in Montenegro, and the minimum salary in Montenegro is 193 euros, which says that it's not only the amount you quoted, 115 euros a month. There are much more allowances given in addition to that. I am fully aware that this is not enough for optimum living or functioning, but the social care of any country is allocated in accordance with the material possibilities of the country. Multidisciplinary teams, the mandate of the multidisciplinary teams for the protection from domestic violence have been established at the level of social welfare centers. In all the centers, all the municipalities are covered, so the mandate is not limited in time, and the representatives of NGOs dealing with the protection of persons of domestic violence are included as members of the multidisciplinary teams, and there is no strict duration of this mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive answers to our third round of questions, and this leaves us 7 more minutes for the concluding statements by State Party and country rapporteur. Please, Head of Delegation, you have the floor.
Hvala uvažena predsjedavajuća. Zaista.
Thank you, Lady Chairperson. Dear members of the committee, it is my particular pleasure and honor to have had the possibility yesterday and today to respond to the numerous questions posed, which indicates the importance of this committee and the importance of the state of Montenegro, which is undertaking everything it can to improve the position of persons with disabilities in Montenegro. What I have to say is that for many years in Montenegro there was a stigma, certain, when it comes to the persons with disability. Slowly we are changing this in society. I'm aware that this is a process and that we need time for all of this, but as a responsible society, as a country, we are willing and ready to undertake, and we are undertaking all the steps necessary to equal the position of persons with disabilities in social community with other citizens in this community. Certainly, all of these comments we receive and any questions we failed to answer because of the time restrictions will be provided in writing as envisaged anyway by the procedures of the committee, and we will certainly act in accordance with the recommendations we receive coming from this committee. Once again, thank you very much. I think we had an interactive two-day dialogue, and I hope to see you again soon once we meet the measures you require from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Head of Delegation. Country Rapporteur, Mr. Lavashi, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. I think we can confirm that by the end of this constructive dialogue, we have learned a lot from each other. However, there are a lot of things to do, especially together with the Montenegrin DPOs. We have identified, indeed identified convincing progress, even significant ones in some areas, but also some backlogs or obstacles in terms of the implementation of the Convention. Even some misunderstandings, especially when it comes to the medical approach interpreted during the application of the human rights model in the country. In the next days, we are about to adopt a concluding observation for Montenegro, which is the most important document for the State Party before the representatives of the State Party rejoin us again in the future. I hope, as I always highlight, these recommendations shall fully be observed and executed by the government in close consultation with as many organizations and representatives of persons with disabilities as possible, not only at the state but also local levels. Because perhaps the local level is the most important one when it comes to the implementation of the Convention and realizing the rights of persons with disabilities. I'm sure the government of Montenegro, as convincingly indicated during these 2 days, will strengthen its commitments regarding the implementation of the Convention. Finally, I hope all relevant documents regarding our work, the concluding observations in particular, will be published and made available and accessible for the public in the State Party in due time. Thank you for your contributions, and I wish you a safe way back home. Thank you.
That ends our constructive dialogue with the distinguished delegation of Montenegro. I thank you very much for coming to this committee. I found this dialogue very interactive and constructive, and we hope that our concluding observations will help you to further implement the CRPD in Montenegro. Thank you so much. And I thank the interpreters for giving us again extended time. I know I have stretched your friendliness in this week. I hope I will do better next week. Thank you again also to the sign language interpreters. The dialogue is closed. Thank you very much.